When I was a beginner quilter, I took a class on how to make this quilt. The teacher did a great job in showing us how to cut the fabric, how to strip piece, how to put the 9 patches together, how to make the rail fence blocks. This is a quilt that's on point. The blocks were made this direction so they look like squares, but then we turn them on point to make them look like diamonds. But when I took the quilt home to put the blocks together, I was very confused about how to do that because they're squares, but then they're diamonds. It was hard for me to figure out how to put the blocks in a way that would actually wind up becoming a rectangle in the end. I had a lot of questions about how to put this quilt together, and since then I've made lots of on-point quilts. So what I did was I harkened back to my beginner quilter days and came up with a big list of questions that I had about how to put quilts on point, and I'm going to try to answer them for you. I'm going to use lots of examples with all the quilts that I've made so far. Let's get started. What's an on-point quilt? When a quilt is on point, the blocks are placed on one of the points like a diamond rather than straight. Instead of horizontally and vertically, the blocks are diagonal. But instead of just straight squares right next to each other, having the squares on point so they look like diamonds actually just makes the shape, just makes the quilt a little more interesting. So here's the quilt that is on point. I have the 9 patch blocks, I have some plain blocks, and I set the whole quilt on point so that it kind of accentuates the quilt. And as you can see, it elevates a simple 9 patch block into something a little bit higher. So here's what it would look like as a straight setting, just plain 9 patches. And there's 9 patches are wonderful, there's nothing wrong with them, but as I get more experience with making quilts, I just want my quilts to look like they're difficult. And so this one actually makes the quilt, I can still make my 9 patches and still use the plain blocks, and by adding those triangles in the corners, it just elevates the quilt a little bit in my eyes. In this quilt, the blocks are set on point. These triangles, they're 3-dimensional triangles. That just helps elevate the quilt a little bit more. And besides just putting the blocks on point, you can make your whole quilt on point. In this quilt, you can see there's only one block. The entire main body of the quilt top is set on point so that it again adds a little bit extra to the quilt. Why would you even put the blocks on point? Why can't you just use a straight setting? And you can. There's nothing wrong with a straight setting. A straight setting is a perfectly good way to make a quilt. So one reason why you put a quilt on point is that it makes a very simple shape more interesting. I think it elevates the quilt to make it look more complicated than it is. You may notice that sometimes when there's a glamour shot of a quilt, you may notice that the magazines put the quilt on point when they show it to you because it really helps accentuate the quilt and it just elevates it. It makes it look so much more complicated, so much nicer than the plain setting that would be. Plain settings are just fine, square settings are fine, but this somehow elevates the quilt to make it more interesting. Another reason why you would put a quilt on point, so there's 3 reasons why you put a quilt on point. One is just to elevate the quilt to make it look more interesting. Another one is to help accentuate the design. I have this quilt that's a straight setting and it looks just fine the way it is, but I think if I would have put them on point, the hearts would be easier to see and the quilt would have been a cuter quilt. So in this case, one of the reasons why you can put a quilt on point is that sometimes it helps accentuate the design that you want to show. And then a third reason is that depending on the number of blocks, if you're low on the number of blocks, because the diagonal of a square is longer than the straight sides, you don't need as many blocks if you're using a on-point setting. So you may be able to make your quilt a little bit bigger without having to make more blocks. It's not a lot easier depending on the complexity of your quilt blocks. It doesn't save you a lot of time because you do have to sew in all the triangles. around the corners. But if you're low on fabric for your main block, it's a great way to be able to use fewer blocks.
Do I have to set the blocks on point to make diamonds like that?
You don't always have to put a quilt on point to make it look like it is. For example, in this quilt uses a straight setting. It's the pattern itself that makes these blocks look like they're on point, but they're not. This flying geese at the top just helps finish off the design. And so you can see that it's really not necessary in this case to put the quilt on point. It was just fine the way it was without that. This one also looks like it might be on point, but it really isn't. This is a straight setting. It's just the use of the colors that makes it look like it's on point. You can see right here that the block itself is square. It's just made with 4 half square triangles, and then the fact that all of these colors are the same or same low value colors is what makes the quilt look like it's on point.
You said you were confused about how to lay out a quilt on point, and yet now you've made lots of quilts. So what's the secret? So tell me the secret on how to wrap your brain around setting a quilt on point. How do you lay out a quilt on point without getting confused?
Sometimes when you're trying to put a quilt on point, it's a little complicated because you have to wrap your brain around looking at diagonals that are going this direction, but you want to make sure that your quilt is square in this direction. Sometimes difficult to just lay out the blocks, and especially if you're messy like I am, it just makes it hard to make it lay out in a way that you know that it's going to work. So the first time that I made this, I was really confused, and I went to a quilt class and they told me go home and just look at the picture and match up the picture. But I did it. It worked out okay, I guess, but it was still difficult for me to try to figure out how to get it all to work right. It just was really complicated for me, more complicated than I think it needs to be. So what I finally figured out when I finally got to the end of the project is that the way I should be looking at it, instead of looking at it this direction in a rectangle form, I should actually be looking at it as a triangle. So if you look at this quilt, on point, and that's one of the good things about having a design floor instead of a design wall,
Is that you can move your body to the center of the quilt so you can see it.
as a half square triangle pretty much. So just cut the quilt in half here, and what happens on this side of the quilt is going to be the same thing that happens on this side of the quilt. So if you look at it as 2 parts of a whole, then you can look at it as straight seams instead of diagonal seams. So let me see if I can, okay, make sure you can see the whole thing. Make sure that my cutting board doesn't fall. So you always start with the corner triangle at the top because that's your corner of your quilt. And then you can see that now if you're looking at it this direction, you're seeing straight rows. And basically what you're looking for is, instead of looking for a rectangle or a square, you want to make a triangle. And that to me just made it so much easier to try to understand what's happening with this quilt. So you start with 1 block, then you have 2 little wings to make it make your triangle fit correctly. Then you've got your 3 blocks and 2 more triangles. These are setting triangles is what they're called. I call them wings. But these setting triangles will help make this work. And then you have the 5. So it goes in odd numbers. So you go 1, 3, 5, 7. And so you've got your 5, and you got your 2 setting triangles, you've got your 7, you've got your setting triangles, and the same thing happens on the other side. Now the magic happens here in this middle row. As you're adding each row, you get to decide if you're done with this quilt or if you want to keep adding more in either direction, to how you make your size of your triangle to be. So as you're adding this one, you decide whether or not you want this quilt to be bigger. Now most people would want to have more than 1 block quilt, but say you didn't want more than a 1 block quilt, what you would do is, instead of using a side setting, you would use your end corners, and your quilt would be done here with 1 block on point. But say you decide you wanted another row, then you would put your side triangles in here you put another setting triangle here, and then you can keep going. But say you decided that you wanted to quit here,
you would add corner triangles to both sides. Generally, when I start with the quilt, I start with the corner triangle, then I add the block right underneath it. Try to make sure that I'm just keeping track of the triangles, the length and the width. If I want to make a longer quilt, I'd put a corner triangle on the left side. If I want a wider quilt, I would put a corner triangle on the right side. Notice that I'm making sure that the right angle of the triangle is matching the right angle of the block so that it forms a triangle at the end. It's pretty easy to see how to place the triangles, because if you place them in the wrong direction, then you will lose your triangle shape that you have when it is placed correctly. So if you place the triangles upside down, it's not going to look right. If you place them a different direction here, it's not going to look right. You just want to make sure that you're forming a nice straight line with the bottom row of your triangle. And then you can move on to your next row. To add the blocks, there's a block underneath each of the block and the triangles that you already have in the row above that. And then once you have those blocks, then you can decide on your triangles. Then I make the same decision as I did in the row before. If I want the quilt to be wider, then I would add a side setting triangle to the right side. If I want the quilt to be longer, I put a side setting triangle on the left side. But if I wanted to stop either the length or the width, then I would use a corner triangle instead of a side setting triangle. You'll notice that I'm going directly down from the corner triangle. You notice that I'm following the corner triangle and just adding the row right underneath it, and then adding the sides as I go along. Eventually the sides will have to change, but until then I can just follow that corner triangle to keep myself grounded. I continue to use this process to add the rows until I get the length and the width that I want for this quilt. And then when I'm finished with that, then I finish the other side of the quilt the same way, except that my corner triangles will be going the opposite direction. If I'm feeling especially directionally challenged, instead of making the other side of the quilt as a part of this one, making sure that all the corner triangles are going the other direction, what I can do, I can make 2 half sides of the quilts, and then I can just put them together at the end.
and so you can just keep adding on to the quilt until you like the size that it is. But as you can see, the same thing is happening on both sides until your middle row or rows. You can actually have more than one middle row that looks like this. Normally when I work on these quilts, I only look at the setting triangles and the squares, and I can just add the 4 corners at the very end. So basically the point is that you're starting from the corner half square triangle, just looking at the triangles. If you just you're looking to make a triangle and not a top. Instead of trying to look at it diagonally, I'm looking at straight rows and just deciding how many rows I need. And then I can just look here to make sure I'm going in the straight direction, depending on how long, the length and the width that I want of the quilt. But looking at it in straight rows just makes a lot more sense to me. And basically you have a block and you have your wings, you have your blocks, you have your wings, you have your blocks, and you either have your wing or your corner. So as the middle rows are the ones that you have to pay the most attention to, because you're changing whether you're having a wing or a corner on there. Notice that because this is a rectangular quilt, this one has a corner, but it has a wing on the other side. It has a side setting triangle on the side. The corner is over here. It has a side setting triangle on this side. So they both don't have the end pieces and the corner triangles. And that's why I wait until the very end before I put in my corner triangles. I can just keep putting the setting triangles on both sides, and then not put any triangles until I'm ready, until I know that's which ones I need at the middle rows. But the end rows, you can continue adding the setting triangles on both sides.
If I decide to design my own quilt instead of using a pattern, What material do I need to make an on-point quilt?
Okay, in order to make a quilt with squares on point, you're going to need three things. First of all, you're going to need your squares. These are 1.5 inches, so they'll finish at 1 inch. The second thing you need is the corner pieces. These are cut at 1 7/8. These squares are cut at 1 7/8 and then cut diagonally from corner to corner to make the two triangles. So these will work as the corners for the quilt. So you need 4 of these for your quilt. Just one for each corner. The other thing that you're going to need is the setting triangles, and these setting triangles were cut at 2 1/4. You cut a 2 1/4 inch square, cut them on both directions, and then you can just use them in each of the places that you need a setting triangle for. Upside down. And the reason that we're cutting them in this direction, this way, having two different ways to cut the triangles, is so that the straight of grain is on the outside edges. So as you can see with your half square triangles, the bias is here and the straight of grain is here. With these triangles, the straight of grain is here and the bias is on the inside, so that when you put them into the quilt, then your quilt will have a straight of grain on the outside. I'll just make it a little bit less bias to have to deal with in your quilt.
How do you measure the triangles for an on-point quilt? First, you subtract 1/2 inch from the cut size to find the finished size of the block. Then you divide the finished block size by 1.414 and add 7/8 of an inch and round up to the nearest 1/8 increment. This square you're going to cut diagonally corner to corner. You need 2 squares to make 4 corner triangles. For the side setting triangles, you will take the finished block size, multiply by 1.414, then add 1 1/4 inch, round up to the nearest 1/8 inch. Then you'll cut that square diagonally corner to corner, both directions, so that will give you 4 rectangles. Then you'll cut as many as you need for your quilt. Since you've already done the math, will you share a chart with us? Of course I will. I'll put a link in the description box for a free chart. I used a spreadsheet to make this. I've compared my numbers with other charts that I found online, and I'm confident that my numbers are right. This chart goes up in 1/4 inch increments from 1 inch to 30 inches, so it will work for many different sizes of quilts, and I made the words big enough to see. How do you know how many squares and triangles you need to make the quilt the size you want it to be? You can use this graph paper to figure out how many blocks that you need, measure against the diagonal to find out how big each width will be. Remember to subtract out the seam allowance and then multiply by the number of blocks you have in each row and each column. Don't forget to include the side setting triangles. Can you use rectangles instead of squares? Yes, as long as the finished size of your rectangle is the same as the finished size of your squares. Don't forget to add the seam allowance. What if your blocks are too big or too small? If all your blocks are the same size, that's just fine. You can just adjust your size of your setting triangles. If some of your blocks are too big, you can trim them, or you can hide some of the excess in the seam allowance. If your block is too small, you will have to make a new one, because that may cause a problem in the integrity of your quilt, and some of your seams may just come out if they're too small. What if your triangles are too big or too small? It's not a problem if your triangle is too big. It'll just be larger than the size of your quilt, and you can just have a larger border, which you can trim. If it's too small, it may cause a problem with your edges. It won't make the points on your edges will not be sharp. You showed us wonderfully how to lay out a quilt. How do you add more blocks if you decide to make it bigger?
Okay, so I have my half square triangles done for this quilt, As you can see, they look exactly the same. They all have the corner triangle at the top. They have the setting triangles on the sides, and then they have the blocks, the same number of blocks on both sides. And I can easily just sew these up together to make my quilt. This one's just gonna be a little bit different if I do it this way because I have the two side setting triangles together instead of a corner triangle, but that works fine. Another thing I could do is I can add another row if I want to make it larger. And if I do that, then I can add some corner triangles to each side. And that'll make the quilt still square. I can also add another row if I want to make it larger. It goes this way. And so there'll be a setting triangle here and a corner triangle here. And there's a corner triangle here and a setting triangle here. There's another one this way. So that'll make a longer quilt.
How do you piece a quilt or a block on point? There are two different ways that I sew the blocks for an on-point quilt. One way, which is what I'm doing in this video here, is to sew them row by row. So right now I'm just sewing a side setting triangle to each of the squares on the right. That is a good way to organize it, even though the number of blocks for each row are different. Another way that I work on it is the two sides at the same time. So I will add the two side setting triangles to the row that only has one block. What that means is I will add, say, the right side setting triangle to the top of the quilt, then the right side setting triangle to the bottom of the quilt, then I'll go back to the top of the quilt and add the left side setting triangle to that same block, to that same row, and then I'll go back and do the left side setting triangle to the bottom row. And that way I'm working on both sides of the quilt at the same time. And once I'm done with those two rows, I can go ahead and work on the second rows in the top side and the bottom side of the quilt. So basically I'm just trying to make those two half square triangles at the same time. And then once I'm done with that first row, then I'll work on the second row so that I can make sure that there's always a piece of fabric that's underneath the sewing machine presser foot. As you can see, I'm keeping my layout here on a diagonal so that the blocks to me look like they're horizontal, so it looks like the way that I'm used to looking at when I'm making other types of quilts. That's a lot of information in one video. Will you show me more quilts now?
And you can also set your quilts on point in a different way. In this quilt, the blocks are a straight setting, but they're kind of set on point because they are tilted a little bit. All of these little pumpkins, instead of actually setting them on point with big triangles, they're set on point with small pieces here. And so you can see that the block is kind of tilted a little bit so that it does look like it's set on point. This is not called set on point, but it's just a cute little technique to help elevate your quilt blocks. In this quilt, the quilt is not set on point. They're exactly square blocks, but you can make a quilt look like it's set on point just based on the design, the way the blocks are designed and put together. In this quilt, likewise, using the quarter square triangles, the quilt looks like it's set on point just because of all of the triangles, but it really isn't. This is a straight setting, but it has an interesting diamond shape just because of the design that's formed in here. In this quilt, I set the blocks on point. And it really elevates a simple rail fence block. It's just two strips that are sewn together, alternating, but it looks so much more interesting because the quilt is set on point. This quilt with the quarter square triangles is not set on point. Because they're quarter square triangles, they kind of have that look without the actually setting it on point. So you don't have to set a quilt on point. It just depends on what kind of effect that you're looking for. And likewise, this one looks like these blocks are set on point, but they're not. They're just cornerstones on the original block. And so, again, you don't have to set a quilt on point to show the diamond shapes. Again, it just depends on the pattern. This is the quilt that I finished that has the squares on point, and it adds a nice little touch and makes the blocks a little bit more interesting than they would when they were just straight, especially with all these light colors. It's not a very, I don't think it'd be a very interesting quilt with just a small number of fabrics and in the light colors that are pretty close in shade to each other. Setting them on point really elevated this quilt. In this video, I tried to answer all the questions that I would have as a beginner quilter on how to set blocks on point, how to set quilts on point. I tried to think of all of the questions that I would have on how to set a quilt on point. If I missed anything, if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask me, and I'll be happy to answer all of the questions that you have. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of your support, and I'll see you in the next video.